She built a secret room beneath her own house to answer one question that had haunted her for 11 years. And when the answer finally came, it belonged to someone else entirely, a stranger's secret, hidden inside her own. By the time anyone understood what Lady Eleanor Vane had actually built beneath Cavendish Row, it was already too late to stop it. Too late to stop the deaths. Too late to stop the machine her grief had accidentally become. And almost too late for her to do anything about it at all. This is the story of a widow, a resurrection man, and a ledger that was never supposed to be read by anyone but her. Stay with me, because the ending of this one is not what you think. On the outside, nobody suspected a thing. On Thursday afternoons, callers came and went from the front parlour of the Cavendish Row house, exactly as they were meant to. They took tea from good china, remarked politely on the weather, admired the widow's composure, and left believing they had glimpsed the whole of her, a quiet, dignified woman of independent means, still faithful to a grief that some of them privately thought was, by now, a little old-fashioned to dwell on so long. Nobody thought to ask what lay 2 floors beneath their feet, past the kitchens, behind a row of dusty wine racks. Nobody had any reason to move. That was rather the genius of it, if genius is even the right word for something built entirely out of sorrow. A wealthy widow's house was one of the most private spaces in all of London. More private, in its own way, than a gentleman's club. More private than a magistrate's own study. Nobody audited a widow's cellar. Nobody demanded to inspect a grieving mother's private rooms. Society had built her a kind of invisible fortress out of pity and propriety, and Eleanor Vane, without ever quite meaning to, had turned that fortress into something far stranger than anyone watching her could possibly have imagined. Lady Eleanor Vane kept 2 ledgers. The first sat in plain view on her writing desk in the front parlour of her townhouse on Cavendish Row, a fashionable address in early 19th century London, the kind of street where a widow of good breeding was expected to be seen at church on Sundays, to receive callers on Thursday afternoons, and to keep tidy household accounts that any visiting relation might glance over without raising an eyebrow. That first ledger recorded exactly what a lady's ledger was supposed to record. Tallies of coal and candle wax, wages for a staff of 9, the cost of mutton and lamp oil and morning crepe, ordinary arithmetic, the polite, visible bookkeeping of a wealthy widow's life. It's worth pausing here for a moment, because the world Eleanor Vane lived in had very particular rules about what a widow was allowed to be. In Regency and early Victorian England, a widow of means occupied a strange, narrow space in society. She had more legal and financial independence than a married woman, who under the law of coverture essentially ceased to exist as a separate legal person the moment she wed. A widow, by contrast, could own property, sign contracts, and run a household entirely on her own authority. But that independence came bundled with intense social surveillance. She was watched for signs of impropriety, judged by the depth and duration of her mourning, expected to grieve visibly but never excessively, and above all, expected to remain respectable. A woman like Eleanor, wealthy and unmarried by circumstance rather than choice, was one of the most closely watched figures in London society, which made what she was actually doing behind that false panel in her late husband's study all the more remarkable, because for 11 years, not a single caller, not a single relation, not a single member of her household staff, outside of 2 trusted servants, ever suspected a thing. The second ledger lived behind that false panel. It recorded something else entirely. Dates, names, sums paid to men who never gave their real ones, and, in a smaller, tighter hand, as though she were ashamed even of her own handwriting, notes on every body that had passed through the hidden room beneath the house. Male, approximately 40 years of age, no marks of struggle, cause of death unclear. Female, approximately 60, consumption, evident in the state of the lungs. Male, approximately 9 years old. God forgive me. That last entry was 11 years old. She had never been able to bring herself to write anything beside it since. It had started, as these things so often do, with the worst day of her life. Her son Thomas had drowned in the Serpentine, the long, curving lake that still runs through Hyde Park in London today, and which in the early 19th century was one of the most popular spots in the city for skating in winter and boating in the warmer months. On a September afternoon, when he was 8 years old, or so the physician said, he pressed 2 fingers to a small wrist gone cold, listened for a heartbeat that did not come, and pronounced the boy gone before Thomas had even finished dripping onto the drawing room floor. To understand what happened next, it helps to understand exactly how uncertain the practice of medicine still was in this period. In the early 1800s, there was no reliable clinical test for death. Physicians relied on the absence of a detectable pulse, the absence of visible breath on a mirror held to the lips, and the cooling of the body, none of which were infallible, especially in cases of drowning, where the body's systems could slow dramatically without actually stopping. Cases of people revived after being declared dead were not urban legend. They were documented, discussed in medical journals, and widely reported in newspapers. This uncertainty had given rise to an entire cultural anxiety that historians now refer to as taphophobia, the fear of being buried alive, which reached something close to a mania in Britain and parts of Europe during this era. Inventors patented so-called safety coffins fitted with bells, flags, and breathing tubes that a mistakenly buried person might use to signal the world above. Some families paid to have loved ones' bodies watched for days after apparent death, waiting for any sign of movement before allowing burial to proceed. It was not an eccentric fear. It was, for a certain kind of grieving, anxious mind, a perfectly rational one. It had been an ordinary afternoon, right up until it wasn't. Thomas had gone out with his nursemaid to watch the boats, as he did most fine Septembers, and had wandered, as boys of 8 will do, when nobody is watching closely enough for a single unguarded minute, toward the edge of the water, where the bank dropped away more steeply than it looked. There was no cry heard, no splash anyone could later swear to. There was only a small boy found face down in shallow water, some 20 minutes later, by a passing gentleman out walking his dog, and a nursemaid who would carry the guilt of those 20 minutes for the rest of her working life, whatever kindness Eleanor later showed her. By the time Thomas was carried home, wrapped in the gentleman's own coat, he had already stopped breathing by every measure anyone in that drawing room knew how to take. The physician who arrived within the hour did everything that was medically expected of him in 1815. Pressed his fingers to the boy's wrist and throat, held a small mirror to his lips to check for the faint fog of breath, watched for even a flicker beneath the eyelids, and found nothing. He was not a careless man, nor an unkind one. He simply worked within the limits of what medicine in that era actually knew, which, when it came to distinguishing a body in the deepest stages of cold water shock from a body truly and finally dead, was not very much at all. Eleanor held her son through the long night before the undertaker arrived, because no one in the household had the heart or the courage to take him from her before she was ready. And somewhere near dawn, in that grey, hollow hour before the household stirred, with the lamps burned low and her own eyes raw from a night without a single tear shed in front of anyone, she felt, or believed she felt, or had spent 11 years afterward convincing herself she felt, a single, small contraction of his hand around her finger. She told no one. What was there to tell? A mother's grief plays tricks on the mind, everyone would have said, and perhaps they would even have been right. The physician had been certain. The certificate was signed and sealed. The boy was buried 4 days later in the Vane family plot at Kensal Green, in a coffin lined with white silk, in a cemetery that was, at the time, one of London's grand new garden cemeteries, vast, landscaped burial grounds built on the outskirts of the city in the 1830s and after, in direct response to the overcrowded, disease-ridden, and frankly horrifying state of London's old inner-city churchyards, which by this period were so packed with the dead that gravediggers routinely had to break apart older burials just to make room for new ones. Kensal Green, opened in 1833, would become the first of these new cemeteries, though for the purposes of this story, set slightly earlier, Thomas's grave belongs to that same growing movement toward more dignified, spacious burial grounds for those who could afford them. Eleanor stood at the graveside in her mourning veil and did not scream, because a lady of her station did not scream, not even for this. She went home, and in the privacy of her own mind, she began, very quietly, to come undone. Not in the way the physicians of the day would have recognized or diagnosed. She did not take to her bed. She did not refuse food. She did not weep for months on end in the manner Victorian etiquette almost expected of a bereaved mother. Instead, she read. She wrote letters, under a false name, to protect her reputation, to men of science in Edinburgh and Vienna, cities that were, at the time, among the leading centers of medical research in Europe. She asked them about galvanism, the study of how electrical current could cause dead muscle tissue to twitch and contract, a field made famous just a few years earlier by the Italian scientist Giovanni Aldini, who had performed public demonstrations reanimating the limbs of executed criminals' corpses with electrical currents, demonstrations so unsettling to public audiences that many scholars believe they directly inspired a young Mary Shelley to write Frankenstein, published in 1818. Eleanor asked her correspondents about the signs by which even a trained physician might mistake deep unconsciousness for true death. She asked about how long a body might survive without air. And she read, with a horror she could not look away from, the growing number of accounts in the penny papers, the cheap, widely circulated newspapers of the era, describing coffins opened during churchyard relocations and found scored on the inside, fingernails torn away, the occupants having very clearly not been dead at all when the earth went in over them. She wore the black silk and bombazine expected of a mourning mother, and observed the calendar of grief society had laid out for her almost to the letter. The deep mourning of the first year, the half-mourning of muted lavenders and greys that followed it, the small mourning brooch woven, as was fashionable at the time, from a lock of the departed's own hair, worn pinned at her collar where any caller could see it and read it correctly as devotion. It was, in every visible respect, a textbook performance of Regency grief. What none of those callers could see was that behind the correct clothing and the correct calendar, Eleanor was quietly building something else entirely, a private, obsessive education in the exact medical uncertainties her son's death had exposed. She wrote, under a false name, to physiologists in Edinburgh and Vienna, asking pointed, careful questions about the signs of apparent death, and received back long, technical replies that she copied out and cross-referenced by candlelight, long after her household had gone to bed. She sent away for pamphlets describing the new safety coffins being patented across Germany and England, devices fitted with bells or small flags on springs, connected by cord to a corpse's hand, so that anyone mistakenly buried alive might ring for help from beneath the earth. She read and reread every account she could find of watchers paid to sit beside a body for days after apparent death, waiting for the faintest twitch before allowing burial to proceed at all. None of it answered her question. All of it fed the same quiet, gnawing certainty that the physician who examined her son had been working from a science too crude to be trusted absolutely. It's worth understanding just how visible mourning was as a social institution in this period, because it explains how Eleanor was able to hide something so extraordinary in plain sight. Mourning jewelry, rings, brooches, and pendants, woven from a deceased loved one's hair, or set with small painted miniatures of an eye or a willow tree bent in grief, known collectively as memento mori pieces, was an enormously popular and entirely unremarkable fashion among the wealthy of this era. A widow who wore her son's hair pinned at her collar for a decade was not considered strange in the least. She was considered, if anything, admirably faithful to his memory. The entire visual language of Regency mourning was built to broadcast grief outward, loudly and conventionally, precisely so that no one would ever think to look for anything unconventional hiding underneath it. By the second year of her grief, she had a private room built into the cellar of the Cavendish row house, disguised behind what appeared, to any casual observer, to be nothing more than a well-stocked wine store. By the third year, she had found Josiah Crick. It's worth lingering, just briefly, on how widespread this particular fear had become across Europe by the early 19th century, because it helps explain why a woman as intelligent and otherwise level-headed as Eleanor Vane could spend a decade of her life chasing it without anyone around her finding the obsession entirely unreasonable. Germany in particular saw an extraordinary flowering of safety coffin patents during this period, including elaborate designs featuring glass viewing panels set into the coffin lid, ventilation shafts running up through the earth to the surface, and cord and bell mechanisms so sensitive that even the involuntary muscle twitch of a truly dead body was known, on more than one embarrassing occasion, to set the bells above a fresh grave ringing in the dead of night, sending a churchyard watchman running for a shovel to dig up someone who, in the end, had never woken at all. Public waiting mortuaries, where the recently deceased were laid out for several days under careful observation before burial was permitted, existed in several German cities well into the century. None of this was fringe superstition. It sat, however uneasily, alongside serious medical debate about the genuine limitations of contemporary methods for confirming death, debate that would not be meaningfully resolved until diagnostic techniques improved considerably later in the century. Eleanor Vane's fear had, in other words, an entire continent's worth of company. What set her apart was not the fear itself, but the sheer scale of what she was ultimately willing to build in service of answering it. Josiah Crick was not, at first glance, a frightening man. He was narrow-shouldered and soft-spoken, with the permanently ink-stained fingers of someone who had once trained as a clerk before drink cost him his position and his prospects. He did not look like a man who spent his nights crouched in Southwark churchyards with a wooden spade and a canvas sack, working by lantern light to remove the recently buried from the ground. That, Eleanor would come to understand, was rather the point. The good ones never looked like what they actually were. This is a good moment to talk about what Crick actually did for a living, because his profession, the so-called resurrection trade, is one of the strangest and most morally tangled corners of British medical history. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the demand for human cadavers to teach anatomy in medical schools far outstripped the legal supply. Under English law at the time, the only bodies that could legally be dissected for medical study were those of executed criminals, a category that shrank steadily as capital punishment was gradually reduced for lesser offences through the early 1800s, even as the number of medical students in cities like London and Edinburgh climbed rapidly. The math simply didn't work. Medical schools needed far more bodies than the gallows could supply, and so an entire underground economy grew up around the quiet, illegal removal of freshly buried corpses from churchyards, almost always the graves of the poor, who could not afford the iron cages called mortsafes, or the paid night watchmen that wealthier families used to guard their dead until decomposition made the bodies useless to anatomists. This trade would not become obsolete until the Anatomy Act of 1832, passed by Parliament in the direct aftermath of a series of shocking scandals, most infamously the Burke and Hare case in Edinburgh, where two men grew impatient with digging and began actively creating their own supply of bodies instead. The 1832 Act finally allowed medical schools to legally claim the unclaimed bodies of the poor from workhouses and hospitals, which solved the anatomist's supply problem, though at a moral cost historians still debate, since it essentially formalized the idea that the bodies of the poor belonged to science in death, whether they consented or not. Their first meeting had taken place not in the cellar, but in a coffee house near the borough, arranged through an intermediary, a junior surgeon at Guy's, who owed Eleanor's late husband a debt he was glad to repay quietly and without questions. Crick had arrived exactly on time, ordered nothing, and sat with his ink-stained hands folded on the table as though he were interviewing for a clerkship rather than negotiating the sale of the dead. He had asked her almost nothing about why a titled widow wanted a private supply of bodies delivered to her own home. In 3 years, he would ask her only once, and accept without argument the answer she gave him, which was not the true one. Men in his trade, she came to understand, survived precisely because they had trained themselves out of curiosity. Curiosity got resurrectionists caught, or worse, got them talking to the wrong people in the wrong taverns. Crick's silence was not loyalty, it was professional discipline, and Eleanor respected it more than she would ever have admitted to him directly. Eleanor paid Crick better than any surgeon in London paid his own suppliers, and in exchange, she asked for one thing beyond simple freshness, that every single body be brought to her, and examined by her own hand, in the hidden cellar room, before it was ever entered into her ledger and sent onward, quietly, and always at no profit to herself, to the dissection theatres at Guy's Hospital or St. Thomas's, for the instruction of medical students. She was not doing this for money. She had more of it than she could spend across 3 lifetimes. The bodies that passed her scrutiny and left her cellar travelled onward to lecture theatres that any student of medical history would recognise as genuinely important to the profession's development. Guy's Hospital and St. Thomas's, standing close together on the south bank of the Thames, were among the leading centres of surgical training in Britain during this period, and the anatomy lessons taught there, however uncomfortable their supply chain remains to modern sensibilities, produced surgeons who would go on to treat thousands of patients with a working knowledge of the human body that simply could not be gained any other way at the time. There were no anatomical models of any real sophistication, no diagrams detailed enough to substitute for direct observation, no way to learn where an artery truly ran, or how a lung actually filled, except by opening a body and looking. Eleanor's private involvement in ensuring the bodies she funded were treated, in her words, as a person's last true service to the living, and not simply a commodity, was one of the few threads of genuine principle she held onto throughout the entire arrangement, a small, private insistence on dignity in a trade that rarely offered any. She was doing it to look, every single time, for some sign, any sign, that the person on her table had been placed in the ground while still alive, so that she might finally either forgive herself for Thomas or condemn herself and be free of the not knowing that had quietly consumed 11 years of her life. The room itself, once finished, was nothing like the Gothic imagining a modern reader might picture. It was clean, well lit by a bank of oil lamps Eleanor insisted on trimming herself each evening, and organized with the same brisk order she brought to her household accounts. A long table scrubbed pale, a wall of small drawers holding instruments a surgeon would have recognized, a ledger stand built specifically to hold the second ledger open while she worked, so that she might write her observations the moment she made them, before doubt or exhaustion could soften what she had seen. She kept the room scrupulously cold, a fact she never had to explain to anyone, since no one but Crick and, eventually, one trusted lady's maid, ever knew it existed at all. It's worth understanding just how badly London's churchyards needed a room like this to exist somewhere, even if none of the men and women it eventually served for good in the medical schools had any idea of its darker second purpose. By the early 19th century, the burial grounds of inner London were catastrophically overcrowded. Centuries of continuous use had left many churchyards raised several feet above street level, packed so densely with the dead that gravediggers routinely broke into older coffins, simply to make room for new arrivals, and the resulting conditions, decomposing remains close to the surface, groundwater contaminated by burial runoff, were increasingly blamed, correctly as it turned out, for outbreaks of disease in the surrounding streets. This crisis was one of the major forces driving the creation of the new landscape cemeteries on London's outskirts in the decades that followed, Kensal Green among the very first of them. It also meant that a resurrection man working the older, denser churchyards close to the city centre had, if anything, an easier time of his grim work than popular imagination usually credits. Soft, recently disturbed ground, shallow graves, and burial registers so disorganized that a missing body might not be noticed for weeks, if it was noticed at all. She never found what she was looking for. Not exactly. What she found instead, in the spring of 1826, was something far worse. Crick brought her 3 bodies that April, more than his usual pace, and priced higher than usual too, though she paid without complaint, since his prices had always tracked the difficulty and danger of a given dig, the depth, the freshness required, the season, the risk of a watchman or a grieving family member catching him at work. The first 2 bodies that month were, by the grim standards of the trade, entirely unremarkable. An elderly bootmaker, dead of dropsy, the old term for the swelling now more precisely diagnosed as edema, often a symptom of heart or kidney failure. A young woman who had made her living on the margins of respectable society, buried at parish expense in a pauper's row of one of London's overflowing churchyards, where Crick could work with almost no fear of interruption, since the poor could rarely afford to have their graves watched. The third body was different. He was a young man, perhaps 25 years old, well-fed, well-muscled, with soft, uncalloused hands that had plainly never held a spade or a needle or done a single day of honest manual labor in his life. His nails were clean and trimmed. His teeth were good, a detail that, in an era before modern dentistry, before fluoride, before regular dental care of any kind existed for most of the population, was itself a quiet but unmistakable marker of wealth. He had not died of fever. He had not drowned. He bore none of the signs of the long, wasting illnesses that Eleanor's decade of grim, self-taught study had trained her eye to recognize instantly. He had died of a single narrow wound between the ribs, on the left side, placed, with unnerving precision, exactly where someone with a working knowledge of human anatomy would aim if they wanted a heart to stop quickly, and with the least possible visible blood. And he had supposedly been buried only 4 days, in a churchyard crick identified as St. Bride's, in the City of London. But the soil packed beneath the dead man's fingernails, which Eleanor examined with the same cold, clinical attention she brought to every single body that crossed her table, was a distinctive red-brown clay. There is a small but important geological detail buried in this observation, and it's worth explaining, because it's the exact detail that unravels everything. London sits on a bed of clay and gravel that geologists call the London Basin, but the composition of that ground varies noticeably from one part of the city to another. The area around St. Bride's, in the old City of London, sits on ground dominated by pale London clay and gravel, not the distinctive iron-rich red clay that Eleanor was looking at under this dead man's nails, which was far more characteristic of ground several miles south, across the river. Eleanor had, over the better part of a decade, personally funded and closely tracked digs across dozens of London churchyards. She knew, in a way that few people outside the resurrection trade itself could have known, the exact texture and color of the soil under nearly every burial ground Crick had ever worked. And she knew, without a shadow of doubt, that this young man had not come out of St. Bride's. She did not simply glance at the soil and draw her conclusion. She worked the way she had trained herself to work over 10 careful years, methodically, and without trusting a single first impression. She scraped a sample from beneath each nail onto a square of white linen, comparing its color against samples she had, almost obsessively, collected and labeled from a dozen churchyards over the years for exactly this kind of comparison, a private reference library of London's burial soil that existed nowhere else in the city. She examined the wound itself with a surgeon's steadiness, measuring its narrow width, noting the absence of the ragged tearing a struggle would have left behind, noting instead the clean, confident angle of a blade that had been placed rather than swung. She examined his hands a second time, and a third, turning them over in the lamplight, cataloguing everything they told her about a life that had never once required physical labor. Whoever this young man had been, he had been born, and had lived, and had died, on the comfortable side of a line that ran straight through the middle of English society, and someone had gone to considerable trouble and expense to make his death disappear across that same line, into a pauper's grave, where nobody with the means or motive to ask questions would ever think to look. She said nothing to Crick that night. She paid him, thanked him, and sent him on his way. Then she sat alone in the cellar with the young gentleman, for that was plainly what he was, whatever his name had been, and opened her ledger to a fresh page, and for the first time in 11 years, she wrote something in it that was not a cause of death. Where is this man actually from? And who wanted him gone badly enough to pay a resurrection man to make his grave look like an ordinary theft? She summoned Crick back within the week. She told him nothing of her suspicion, and instead asked him, mildly, almost idly, as though merely curious, exactly where he had dug the young gentleman up. Crick's hesitation lasted less than a second, but Eleanor had spent 11 years training herself to read the smallest tremors in a room, the way a skilled physician learns to read a pulse through the faintest movement of skin, and she caught it instantly. St. Bride's, milady, as I told you. The soil beneath his fingernails is red clay, Mr. Crick. There is no red clay at St. Bride's. He did not repeat the lie a second time. Instead, his soft clerk's face did something Eleanor had never once seen it do in 3 years of employing him. For just a moment, it looked afraid. There's them as pay better than you, milady, he said carefully, choosing each word the way a man picks his footing on unsteady ground, and them as don't ask you to bring the body to a proper lady's cellar for study, them as just want it put in the ground somewhere quiet and quick, and no questions asked after. Who? I don't get given names, milady. I get given a place, a purse, and told there's more where that came from, so long as I keep my mouth shut afterward. And you took the very same body you buried for them, Eleanor said slowly, and sold it to me, as though it had come honestly out of a churchyard. Here, at last, something that resembled shame crossed his face, the first genuinely human expression she had seen from him in 3 years. A man in my trade doesn't waste a good fresh body, milady. Begging your pardon. I didn't know what he was, didn't know it weren't a natural death, not until I had him out of the ground and saw the wound for myself. By then, I'd already agreed the price with you. I thought, one body's as good as another, once it's out of the earth. Eleanor sat very still for a long moment. You have been burying London's quietly removed dead, she said at last, for someone who pays to make their deaths look like nothing at all. And then you have been digging them straight back up and selling them to me, so that the very evidence of what was actually done to them passes under my hands, into a dissection theatre, where it is cut to pieces by students before anyone ever thinks to ask how a healthy young gentleman came to be lying in a pauper's grave with a knife wound between his ribs. Crick said nothing at all, which was, in its own way, an answer. How many? Eleanor asked. How many of the bodies you have brought me, she clarified, when he did not immediately understand, were taken out of the picture first, and grave-robbed second, rather than the other way round? I couldn't say for certain, milady. A long pause. More than one. Then you will find out for certain, Eleanor said, and something in her voice made Crick, a man who had spent 20 years unafraid of graveyards at midnight, take an involuntary half-step back toward the cellar door. You will tell me every place you have been paid to bury a body quietly in the last 3 years, every purse you did not ask questions about, every man who gave you coin without a name attached to it. And you will do it, Mr. Crick, because if you do not, I will make certain that every magistrate in this city learns exactly what has been passing through your hands, and I promise you, they will not extend to you the courtesy of asking politely first. You'd hang me alongside whoever's been paying me, Crick said, though there was no real fight left in his voice, only the flat calculation of a man doing arithmetic on his own survival. I would rather not hang anyone at all, Mr. Crick. I would rather know who has been using my grief as a convenience and see him answer for it. Help me with that, and what you have done in the meantime need never leave this room. She paused. Fail me, and I promise you, it will. It was not an entirely honest bargain, and some part of Eleanor knew it, even as she made it. But it was, she judged, the only bargain likely to work on a man like Crick, not an appeal to conscience, which she suspected had worn thin in him years before she'd ever met him, but a clear-eyed offer of the one thing his trade had taught him to value, above almost everything else, the promise of being left alone. She did not sleep that night, nor the next. Instead, she sat with 11 years of her own handwriting spread across her writing desk, working back through every entry, every cause of death she had ever scrawled beside every body Crick had ever brought to her cellar, looking, this time, not for the signs of a premature burial she had spent a decade hunting, but for the ones she might have missed entirely, because she had trained her own eye to look for one very specific horror for so long that she had gone blind to almost every other kind. She found four bodies across 3 years, each one noticeably healthier and better fed than the paupers and the fever victims and the consumptives who made up the ordinary grim traffic of the resurrection trade. Each one bearing some small mark she had recorded almost in passing and never once thought to question. A note here about bruising to the throat, possibly from the coffin ropes, a phrase she had written without a second thought at the time. The kind of small clinical shorthand that a decade of grief had taught her to reach for automatically, without ever truly interrogating what it might actually mean. She had built a private room beneath her own house out of a mother's grief, hoping only to satisfy herself that no one, that Thomas, had ever been put into the ground alive. And in doing so, without ever meaning to, she had built the perfect machine for erasing someone else's crimes entirely. Every body that passed beneath her careful, well-meaning scalpel emerged from her cellar as nothing more than an anatomical specimen, its true origins scrubbed invisibly clean by the sheer respectability of her name and the discretion she paid so highly to maintain. No magistrate would ever think to search a titled widow's private study. No coroner would ever be summoned to examine what a room full of medical students had already carved into pieces for a Tuesday morning lesson in human anatomy. She went back over each of the 4 entries a second time, forcing herself to read past her own old clinical shorthand to the human being underneath it, the way she had trained herself, over a decade, never quite to do. The first, 18 months earlier, was recorded simply as male, approximately 30, minor bruising to the throat, no other notable marks. She now remembered him more clearly than she wanted to. His hands unusually soft for a man his age, a signet ring absent from his finger, but leaving behind the faint pale band where one had evidently been worn for years before it was removed. She had noted the ring's absence at the time and thought nothing further of it. The second, some months after, was a young man barely past 20, recorded with a note about a fractured wrist that had healed poorly some years before death, the sort of injury common among gentlemen who rode to hounds and occasionally came off worse for it. She had assumed, at the time, an accident of some kind connected to his eventual death. She understood now that the wrist had almost certainly healed years before he ever met whoever finally killed him, and that she had simply failed to separate an old injury from a new one, because she had not been looking closely enough at anything besides the question that consumed her. The third was older, perhaps 45, and this one troubled her most of all, because she remembered thinking, even at the time, how strange it was that a man of his evident means should have no family come forward to claim him, no notice in any paper she had ever seen mourning his loss. She had written only unexplained internal injury, cause uncertain, and moved on to the next body waiting on her table, because there had always been a next body waiting. The fourth was the young gentleman with the wound between his ribs and the red clay beneath his nails, the one who had finally broken through 11 years of her own deliberate blindness, simply because his hands had been too clean and his soil had been too wrong. 4 men, 4 families, somewhere in London, who had perhaps been told their relation had run off, or fallen into disgrace, or simply vanished, the way inconvenient young men sometimes did, in a city as large and as easy to disappear into as this one. 4 men whose actual ends Eleanor Vane had unknowingly helped erase from the world, one careful ledger entry at a time. Someone in London had been using her son's memory, her guilt, her decade of careful, well-funded secrecy, as a disposal service for the inconvenient dead. And they had been doing it, she now understood, with the same particular, cold clarity of a woman who has spent 10 years quietly rehearsing far worse fears than this one, for at least 3 years running. Only one other person in the entire household had ever been trusted with any part of the truth, a lady's maid named Susan Reeve, who had come into Eleanor's service the year after Thomas's death, and who alone among the staff was permitted below the cellar stairs. ostensibly to help manage linens for the wine store that did not, in fact, exist. Susan had never once asked what truly lay behind that door, and Eleanor had never once volunteered it beyond the barest necessary facts. It was, in its own way, a small mercy Eleanor extended to her, the chance to remain genuinely ignorant of exactly how deep the household's secret ran, so that whatever came of it in the end, Susan Reeve could answer any question put to her with an honest, blameless silence. It's worth pausing here to explain why Eleanor could be reasonably confident that none of this would ever come to a magistrate's attention on its own, without her choosing to bring it there. The office of coroner in this period existed primarily to investigate sudden or suspicious deaths where foul play was suspected, but in practice, an inquest was only ever as thorough as someone with standing chose to make it, and the poor of London died sudden, unexplained deaths by the hundreds every year, without any inquiry beyond a parish burial at public expense. A wealthy young gentleman's disappearance might, in theory, provoke a serious search, but only if his family reported him missing in the first place, rather than quietly accepting whatever explanation, however thin, allowed them to avoid a scandal touching the family name. Faircroft's circle appeared to have understood this asymmetry perfectly, and had built their entire method around it. Choose targets whose disappearance could plausibly be absorbed into a story of disgrace, debt, or simply having gone abroad, and the machinery of official investigation would very likely never engage at all. She did not go to a magistrate. A woman of her standing publicly accusing herself of unwittingly running a body disposal operation for someone else's crimes would end in one of exactly two ways: her total ruin, or her committal to a private rest cure at some isolated country estate for nervous exhaustion, the closest thing Regency society had to formally declaring a wealthy woman unstable without the scandal of the word itself, and either outcome would leave the man actually responsible entirely free. Instead, she went back to Crick, and for the first time, she paid him not for a body, but for a name. He did not take the request well at first. "That's not my trade, milady," he told her, twisting his cap between ink-stained fingers in a gesture she had never once seen him make in 3 years of calm, businesslike dealings. "Digging's one thing, asking after the men who hand out purses to keep other men's mouths shut. That's a different sort of danger altogether, and not one I've any practice surviving." "You have survived a great many things, Mr. Crick, that I imagine you never expected to," Eleanor said. "I am confident you will survive this as well, particularly at the price I am prepared to offer for it." The price, in the end, proved persuasive, in the way prices so often are. It took him a fortnight, moving carefully through a network of taverns and quiet conversations he would never fully describe to her, and cost her considerably more than the bootmaker and the young woman combined. But he came to her at last, murmuring a single word in the cellar doorway, as though even the walls themselves might report him. Faircroft. The name meant nothing to Eleanor at first. Then she remembered exactly where she had heard it before, at her late husband's old club, years earlier, attached to a young barrister of promising family and troubling debts, a man rumoured, even then, to have inherited an estate he could not otherwise have afforded to keep, following the sudden and never quite explained death of an elder cousin, who had stood directly between him and the family title. Before we go further, it's worth understanding just how much weight that word inheritance carried in this period, because it explains almost everything about what Faircroft was willing to do. English inheritance law at the time still overwhelmingly followed the principle of primogeniture, especially among landed and titled families, meaning that estates, titles, and the bulk of family wealth typically passed to the eldest son, or in his absence, the next male heir in the bloodline, almost entirely intact, while younger sons and daughters received comparatively little. For a man like Faircroft, a younger relation with expensive tastes, mounting gambling debts run up in London's fashionable gentlemen's clubs, and no legal path to real wealth so long as an elder cousin stood alive between him and the family estate, the arithmetic of inheritance was not abstract. It was a countdown, and it appeared he had grown tired of waiting for nature to run its course. She sent a discreet letter that same week to an elderly relation of her late husband's, a man who still kept rooms at the same gentleman's club where Faircroft was known to spend most of his evenings, and asked, in the idle, gossiping tone expected of a widow making conversation, whether he had heard anything lately of the Faircroft family. What came back, over the following fortnight, in a series of unhurried letters, full of the kind of casual detail society gossip always seems to carry without anyone quite intending malice by it, painted a picture Eleanor found entirely unsurprising by the time she'd finished reading. Faircroft, it seemed, was well liked at his club, and deeply in its debt in equal measure, a common enough combination among young gentlemen of good name and thin fortune, in an era when a single unlucky evening at the card tables could cost a man more than his annual income, and clubs extended credit to their members with a generosity that assumed, not always correctly, that a good family name would eventually settle the account. He had, by the account of more than one fellow member, spoken with unusual frankness in his cups about the unfairness of a system that left a younger relation waiting decades, sometimes an entire lifetime, for an inheritance that might never come at all if an elder cousin lived to a healthy old age and produced sons of his own. It was, Eleanor's correspondent noted, almost as an afterthought, rather fortunate for young Faircroft that his cousin's health had failed so suddenly, and so conveniently, just as his own creditors had begun to lose patience. The cousin's death itself, when Eleanor finally traced the details through parish records and a discreet conversation with a physician who had attended the family, had been recorded at the time as a sudden decline brought on by a weak constitution, the kind of vague, unquestioned diagnosis a family physician might offer a grieving household without pressing too hard for specifics, especially when the family in question was wealthy, respectable, and disinclined to welcome further inquiry. No one at the time had thought to ask why a man of 41, previously in good health, should decline so suddenly and so completely within the span of a single fortnight. No one, that is, except a widow, 11 years into her own private education, in exactly the kinds of deaths that did not add up. One healthy young man, dead of a single narrow wound, buried under an assumed name in red clay soil, and dug up again within days by a resurrection man, paid handsomely to make it look like ordinary churchyard theft. Eleanor Vane closed her ledger that night, and for the first time in 11 years, felt something move through her that was not grief. It felt, unmistakably, like purpose. She did not confront Faircroft directly. A widow does not simply announce to a rising young barrister that she suspects him of a serious crime, on nothing more than a resurrection man's whispered surname. She would be laughed out of every drawing room in London for the accusation alone, and far worse, she would warn him. Instead, she did what she had spent a decade quietly training herself to do, without a single person in London ever suspecting it of her. She waited, and she watched, and she wrote. She began her own private ledger on the subject of Mr. Faircroft, his debts, his creditors, the timing of his cousin's death, the suspiciously convenient inheritance that followed it, all cross-referenced against every unexplained disappearance the penny papers had reported in the parishes surrounding his properties over the previous 3 years. It was, in effect, one of the earliest amateur exercises in what we would now recognize as pattern-based investigation, the kind of methodical, evidence-gathering approach that would not become formalized as professional detective work in England for several more decades. The Metropolitan Police, founded in 1829, would not establish a dedicated detective branch until 1842. Before that, London's investigative work fell largely to the Bow Street runners, a small, semi-official group of thief-takers and constables operating out of the Bow Street Magistrates' Court since the mid-1700s. Men known, when they were known for anything at all, for their discretion as much as their diligence, and precisely the sort of quiet, careful investigators a woman like Eleanor Vane would eventually need. She sent Crick back out to the churchyards, not to dig this time, but simply to watch, to see who else came digging in the small hours of the night, and for whom, and to note the going rate for a quiet burial with no questions asked. It was slow, cold work, and dangerous in its own quiet way. Twice, Crick found himself sharing a churchyard wall with another resurrection man entirely unconnected to Faircroft's circle, and had to feign an ordinary night's digging of his own to avoid drawing suspicion from a trade that policed its own territory jealously and occasionally violently, since two gangs of resurrectionists competing for the same fresh graves in the same parish was a reliable recipe for a beating, or worse, delivered in the dark by men with nothing to lose and no witnesses to fear. Once, he very nearly walked directly into a private watchman one of Faircroft's circle had evidently hired to guard the burial of a body they clearly did not want disturbed a second time. A near miss that cost Eleanor a considerable sum in additional payment to Crick for what he called, with the flat understatement of a man used to danger, the added risk of the thing. It took her 4 months to build a case no magistrate could easily dismiss out of hand. 4 months in which she learned that Faircroft had not been acting alone, that there existed, just beneath the polished surface of respectable London society, a small, discreet circle of well-connected men, each burdened by debts or inconvenient relations, who had independently discovered the same terrible efficiency Eleanor herself had unwittingly provided. That a body disposed of through a resurrection man, then sold onward into a respectable dissection theatre, simply vanished from the world in a way that no ordinary grave ever could. No family would ever exhume a coffin and demand to know why it stood empty, because no family knew to look. The students had already reduced the evidence to teaching material weeks before anyone thought to ask a single question. There were nights, during those 4 months, when Eleanor Vane genuinely doubted whether she would survive the discovery of her own mistake, with her mind intact, let alone her freedom. She had built her entire private world on the assumption that the cellar was hers alone to control, hers alone to know, and now she understood that a stranger had been reaching into that world for years, without her ever once sensing his hand in it. She found herself, more than once, checking the false panel behind her husband's old study twice in a single evening, certain she had heard some sound below that turned out, each time, to be nothing more than the ordinary settling of an old house. She trusted Crick because she had no real alternative but to trust him, and that dependence sat uneasily with a woman who had spent a decade priding herself on needing no one's discretion but her own. It would have been easy, in those months, to simply seal the cellar, dismiss Crick, and let the whole terrible arrangement quietly end, without ever chasing the name behind it. Many women in her position, she knew, would have done exactly that, and no one watching from the outside would ever have judged them for it. She did not, in the end, allow herself that easier path, not because she was braver than such a choice would have required, but because she had already spent 11 years living inside one unanswered question, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she no longer had any patience left for a second one. And she learned, with a grief that genuinely surprised her, layered strangely on top of 11 older years of grief she thought she already understood the shape of, that her own most private tragedy, a mother's unresolved terror that she had once buried her son alive, had been quietly and invisibly repurposed by strangers into the perfect mechanism for making inconvenient men disappear. Eleanor Vane never went to the newspapers, and she never approached the Bow Street runners directly either. She was too practiced a hand at discretion for that, and far too aware of exactly what her own cellar would look like under a magistrate's lantern, whatever her intentions had been. Instead, 4 months after Crick first brought her a body with red clay under its nails, an anonymous package arrived at the private chambers of a runner known through London's quieter channels, for both his discretion and his particular appetite for cases that made ambitious, well-connected men uncomfortable. Inside it was a ledger, not her own original, but a carefully written copy, with her name appearing nowhere within its pages. It laid out, in painstaking and dispassionate detail, 3 years of deaths, debts, and suspiciously timed inheritances, cross-referenced with dates that a certain resurrection man could confirm under formal questioning, should anyone ever think to ask him under oath, rather than merely under threat of financial leverage. The runner who received the package that morning was a methodical man named Hollis, well known in his own small circle for the patience with which he read through documents most of his colleagues would have dismissed after the first page as the ravings of some anonymous crank. He did not dismiss this one. He spent 3 full days cross-referencing the ledger's dates and figures against parish burial records, club membership rolls, and the account books of at least one moneylender willing, for a modest fee of his own, to confirm which gentleman had recently and unexpectedly settled debts thought unlikely ever to be paid. By the end of the 3rd day, Hollis had assembled enough independent confirmation of the anonymous ledger's claims that he no longer needed to know who had sent it. The facts stood well enough on their own. It's worth understanding how differently a case like this one would have unfolded in a courtroom of this era compared to a modern trial. There was no fingerprint analysis, no forensic pathology in any form a modern viewer would recognize, no scientific test capable of definitively linking a wound to a weapon or a body to a burial site, beyond the kind of painstaking, circumstantial observation Eleanor herself had practiced. Trials at venues like London's Old Bailey in this period relied heavily on witness testimony, documentary evidence, such as financial records and correspondence, and the accumulated weight of circumstance, rather than anything resembling modern physical evidence. A case built on debts, suspicious timing, and a resurrection man's corroborated testimony was, by the standards of the day, a remarkably strong one, which is precisely why Eleanor had spent 4 months making sure every strand of it could be independently verified without ever leading back to her own cellar. Faircroft was arrested that winter, and 2 members of his small circle were taken in alongside him. Neither of the 2 lesser men shared Faircroft's own direct involvement in ending a life. Their part had been financial, arranging the payments that kept Crick and others like him quietly cooperative, and lending, on more than one occasion, the discreet use of their own family properties for a body's brief concealment before it ever reached a churchyard at all. Both eventually gave evidence against Faircroft in exchange for considerably lighter sentences, a common enough arrangement in criminal proceedings of the period, and one that Hollis, ever the methodical investigator, had rather counted on from the very beginning of his inquiry, understanding as he did that a circle built on shared guilt rarely holds together once one member believes his own neck is genuinely at risk. The trial that followed made no mention whatsoever of a widow on Cavendish Row, nor of a hidden room behind a false wine store, nor of a small, quiet grave at Kensal Green that had, 11 years earlier, started every part of this. The penny papers covered the trial with the appetite they reserved for any story involving a respectable young gentleman brought low, running headlines that speculated wildly about motive, while somehow never once landing anywhere near the actual mechanism of what had happened. Faircroft's own defense, mounted by a barrister nearly as well connected as the accused, leaned heavily on the argument that no bodies had ever been produced in evidence, a defense that might well have succeeded in an earlier era, before Hollis had painstakingly built his case on debts and dates, and a resurrection man's corroborated account, rather than on remains that had, by then, long since served their quiet second purpose in a dissection theatre and could never be recovered at all. It was, in its own dark way, the same asymmetry that had let the scheme operate for 3 years in the first place. The total absence of a body, ordinarily the single most damning piece of evidence in a case of this kind, very nearly becoming the reason its architect walked free. The jury, in the end, was not persuaded. Whether they were moved more by the weight of Hollis's financial evidence or by Faircroft's own poor composure under cross-examination, historians reading the surviving trial notes still debate. Eleanor read every column of coverage from the privacy of her own parlour and recognized, with a strange, hollow satisfaction, not one single detail of her own decade in any of it. The papers speculated about gambling debts, about a family feud over the inheritance, about 6 motives that were all, in their own way, true without being remotely complete. Nobody speculated about a widow's cellar, because nobody had any reason to imagine one existed. Eleanor closed her second ledger that year, properly closed it, for the very first time in 11 years, and had the hidden room in her cellar sealed over and turned back, in every visible sense, into an ordinary wine store once more. The week after Faircroft's arrest was made public in the papers, reported, as she had carefully arranged, without any thread leading back toward her, Eleanor Vane went to Kensal Green alone, without her carriage announced, and stood for a long time at her son's grave. It was, she would later note, in the private pages of her third ledger, the first time in 11 years she had gone there without bringing a single question with her. She did not ask the ground beneath her feet whether Thomas had woken in the dark. She simply stood, in the ordinary quiet of an ordinary afternoon, and allowed herself, for the length of one visit, to grieve him as nothing more complicated than a mother grieves a son, without the ledger, without the 10 years of correspondence with strangers in Edinburgh and Vienna, without the cold clinical language she had trained herself to use as armor against a fear too large to hold any other way. She never did learn, in the end, whether her son had drawn a single breath after the physician pronounced him gone. She had spent a decade building an entire secret architecture of grief and obsession around one small, unanswerable question about a child's hand in the dark. And what she found instead, after everything, was an answer to a completely different question. That guilt, left unexamined for long enough in a private room where no one else is watching, can quietly be turned into a tool by someone patient enough to notice it sitting there unused, and that the only real remedy for it, the only thing that actually mattered, in the end, for 4 young men whose names she now kept quietly recorded in a third and final ledger that no one else would ever read, was to stop looking away from what was actually happening directly in front of her, and finally start asking who else might be using her own blind spot to hide something of their own. Before we close this story, it's worth sitting for a moment with just how ordinary Eleanor Vane's original grief actually was for a woman of her era, because that ordinariness is precisely what makes the story so unsettling. Infant and child mortality in early 19th century Britain was staggering by modern standards. In London specifically, a significant percentage of children did not survive to their 10th birthday, felled by diseases like scarlet fever, diphtheria, cholera, and the countless accidents of an era with almost none of the safety infrastructure we now take for granted. Grief on the scale Eleanor experienced was not rare. What was rare, vanishingly, almost uniquely rare, was the sheer scale of resources she was able to bring to bear on that grief, and the strange, secret architecture she was able to build around it, entirely undetected, for over a decade, in the middle of one of the most closely watched cities in the world. There is a particular kind of irony worth sitting with here, and it is this. Everything Eleanor Vane built in that cellar, she built out of a fear that she had failed to see something crucial in front of her, that she had looked at her own son and missed a sign of life the physician overlooked. She spent 11 years training her eye to catch precisely that kind of error, so that she would never again fail to notice what mattered. And the great, terrible irony of her story is that this very same trained attentiveness, focused so completely on one narrow question, allowed an entirely different horror to pass beneath her hands 4 separate times before she finally saw it. Vigilance, it turns out, is not the same thing as sight. A person can watch with tremendous, disciplined care for exactly the wrong thing for years and call it thoroughness the entire time. It's also worth pausing on the quieter tragedy sitting underneath the more dramatic one, that the entire resurrection trade Eleanor Vane funded, employed, and unknowingly became complicit in, existed in the first place because English law of the period placed almost no value whatsoever on the bodies of the poor after death, while placing enormous, almost sacred value on the bodies of the wealthy. It was that exact imbalance, the assumption that no one would notice or care if a pauper's grave were disturbed, while a gentleman's grave never would be, that Faircroft and his circle exploited with such chilling precision. They did not simply take a life and hide it. They took advantage of an entire social hierarchy of whose deaths mattered enough to be investigated, and whose did not, and they used that hierarchy as camouflage. In that sense, The resurrection man's spade and the barrister's inheritance scheme were not two separate crimes running in parallel. They were the same crime, resting on the same quiet, unexamined assumption about which bodies London was actually willing to look at closely, and which ones it had already agreed, without ever quite saying so out loud, not to see. The Vane cellar at the old Cavendish Row address was bricked over entirely in 1841, following the widow's death. It remained sealed, forgotten behind newer renovations and changing ownership for well over a century. In 1958, workmen renovating the property for conversion into flats broke through an old section of cellar wall and found a small locked chest tucked behind what had once been a wine store. According to the brief, almost incidental account later given by the site foreman, the chest was rusted through at its hinges and had to be forced open with a chisel, the wood inside so dry with age that it nearly crumbled at the touch. Beside it, they found a single ledger, its pages filled with a small, tight, careful handwriting that no one at the time could immediately place, and that no one thought, in the ordinary business of a 1950s building renovation, to have properly examined by anyone who might have understood exactly what they were looking at. And folded inside the ledger's back cover, wrapped in a scrap of yellowed linen that had clearly once been kept somewhere warm and close, they found a single small cap, the kind sewn for a young child, sometime in the early years of the 19th century, its stitching still fine and even, the work of someone who had taken real care over it. Kensal Green itself, where this whole story quietly began and quietly ended, went on to become one of the most significant cemeteries in British history, eventually serving as the resting place of numerous notable figures across the 19th and 20th centuries, and standing today as a protected site of considerable historical and architectural interest. Its wide, tree-lined avenues and grand family monuments, a world away from the cramped, overflowing inner-city churchyards that had made a room like Eleanor Vane's cellar and a trade like Josiah Crick's so grimly necessary in the first place. It is a strange kind of symmetry that the same broader anxieties about death, dignity, and the treatment of the body that drove the creation of cemeteries like Kensal Green were, in their own indirect way, the very same anxieties that shaped Eleanor Vane's entire secret decade, a society growing increasingly uncomfortable with how casually it had treated its dead, packing them into overcrowded churchyards, permitting an entire underground economy to dig them back up for study, offering almost no protection at all to the graves of the poor, was, across this same period, slowly and unevenly working its way toward reform. On nearly every front Eleanor's story touches, the garden cemetery movement addressed the overcrowding. The Anatomy Act of 1832 addressed, however imperfectly, the resurrection trade. Advances in clinical medicine across the remainder of the century gradually addressed, if never entirely resolved, the deeper uncertainty about death itself that had driven Eleanor into her cellar in the first place. She could not have known, standing at her son's grave in 1815, that she was living through the last years of an old and frightened relationship with death, that the coming decades would slowly, unevenly, begin to repair. She simply built her own private, desperate answer to a question the rest of the century was still working out, and in doing so, uncovered a horror that had nothing at all to do with the question she started with. There is a temptation, telling a story like this one, to reach for a tidy moral and stop there. Something about the dangers of grief left unchecked, or the strange places obsession can lead even the most careful, disciplined mind. Both of those things are true of Eleanor Vane's story, but neither of them is really the whole of it. The more uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this whole account is that the system she lived inside, a legal and medical world that quietly decided some deaths deserved careful investigation and others did not, that treated a titled widow's private rooms as beyond question, while treating a pauper's grave as fair game for any spade willing to disturb it, was never Eleanor's creation. She simply discovered, by accident, exactly how far that system's blind spots actually extended, and then, in the end, made the deliberate choice to use her own privileged position within it to correct one small, specific injustice it had allowed to flourish, undetected, for 3 years. It did not undo what had already happened to 4 men, whose full stories she was never able to recover. It did not close every ledger she was keeping by the time she was finished, but it was, by any honest measure, more than most people in her position would ever have thought to do at all. The chest, along with its contents, was eventually passed to a local historical society, where it sat largely unremarked upon for years, one small curiosity among many, recovered from a city built in layers, over centuries of ordinary and extraordinary lives. It was only much later, when a researcher finally sat down to read the ledger in full, cross-referencing its entries against old parish and court records, that the true shape of what Eleanor Vane had built and buried and finally used to see justice done began to come back into view. No one who found that chest in 1958 knew the full story behind it, but now you do. Susan Reeve stayed in Eleanor's service until Eleanor's own death in 1841, and if she ever pieced together the true shape of what had passed through that cellar during her years of quiet, incurious service, she never once spoke of it to anyone, then or afterward. When Eleanor's will was read, Susan found herself left a sum of money considerably larger than a lady's maid of her station might ordinarily expect, recorded in the will itself, in language careful enough to satisfy any executor's scrutiny, simply as gratitude for many years of loyal and discreet service. It was, in its own understated way, the closest thing to a public thank you Eleanor Vane was ever able to give anyone for what the two of them had quietly carried together. The third ledger, the one Eleanor kept after Faircroft's conviction, recording nothing but the 4 names she had finally been able to piece together for the men whose ends had passed unremarked beneath her own hands, was never made public in her lifetime, and there is no record that she ever found a way to notify the families of what she had learned without exposing everything else alongside it. It remained, to the very end, an unresolved weight she chose to carry privately rather than risk unraveling the fragile, carefully protected justice she had already managed to secure for 4 men whose real endings she never expected to be able to give completely. Perhaps that, too, is part of what makes her story worth telling now, not simply the neatness of the ending, with its arrest and its trial and its verdict, but the honest, unglamorous residue that a decade of quiet secrecy leaves behind, even when the secrecy is finally put to good use. Not every ledger, in the end, gets to be closed all the way. All right, here's a quick question. Eleanor kept a version of herself hidden from everyone she loved for over a decade. Do you think a person can be fundamentally good while living a double life that large? Also, before you answer the question, if this story kept you listening past the point you meant to stop, please consider subscribing. It's the easiest way to make sure the next one finds you too. Thank you.